In this lesson, we'll discuss another of the common issues you'll encounter in evaluating sentence corrections on the GMAT, and that is modifying phrases. So let's start by just recapping the question logistics for sentence corrections on the GMAT. So these, of course, are assumed to not be the least frequently occurring question type. That's generally critical reasoning. You're going to have approximately the same number of sentence corrections, though, as you do reading comprehension questions in the verbal section. And as I said, generally 2 to 3 more sentence corrections than critical reasonings. Now, the strategic best practices for these question types, of course, are going to be about an average of a minute 30 per question, so a little bit faster than the other question types in the section. You're going to have a pretty hard maximum of 2 minutes for any sentence correction. And you have to minimize yourself to a single reread before eliminating and guessing to save time, because just reading these over and over again, of course, does not necessarily improve the likelihood that you're going to get it correct. And you need to beware of just listening for errors, because unfortunately, our conversational ear for English generally tends to be pretty bad. And instead, you want to visibly look for differences indicating possible common sentence correction issues, including, of course, modifier errors. So, how do we seek those modifier errors? First, you want to consider logical intent to proactively identify any absurd modifier. So, things that you're just like, wait a minute, that's not what the sentence intends to mean. And you want to carefully evaluate both introductory and concluding descriptive phrases. So making sure that any introductory phrase is next to its intended object or subject, and the same for any concluding descriptive phrases. And you need to note subtle changes in the choices that are affecting single descriptive words, because those differences can mean a lot in changing the potential meaning. So your strategic implications: first, this is a commonly tested issue for longer underlines on the sentence correction questions. You want to stop and eliminate choices as soon as an absurd modifier is clearly identified. Once you've determined that the state of New Jersey has no predators, well, now you know that's an absurd meaning, and you can eliminate that and go straight to the answer choices to expedite the process. You also do, of course, want to focus on the intended meaning rather than just applying memorized abstract grammar rules to find these errors. These errors are often difficult to identify if you're focusing solely on grammatical changes. Instead, you again want to think about what the sentence is actually trying to articulate. And you always want to read your choice back into the original sentence to avoid overlooking a possible absurdity. So if you're looking at primarily our other errors, especially those top three of pronoun and article issues, subject verb agreement, and verb tense, you may overlook an absurd modifier for focusing on those more technical differences. Make sure that when you do your final read, you look and think about whether or not all of the modifiers are actually describing the thing that they're intended to. And lastly, this is the most technical aspect of modifiers. You want to beware of misusing adjectives and adverbs in the wrong instances, and we'll talk about how that works here in a moment in this lesson as well. So let's just talk about some different modifying phrases and some different ways that modifiers can be incorrect. So starting with what are known as dangling modifiers. So what happens if a modifier has no target in the sentence? So let's take a look at an example. So if we had a sentence that said, thinking of 1987, many memories came back. Well, the natural question is, who's thinking of 1987? We don't have a subject that is performing that action, or that descriptor can apply to, because you can't have the memories thinking of 1987. Although if you heard this sentence spoken conversationally, you go, well, clearly it's whoever the speaker is. But in the GMAT, the speaker is non-existent, so you have to actually clarify that ambiguity. So if instead the sentence said, thinking of 1987, I had many memories come back, well, now we know who is thinking of 1987. It's me, and that's clear. Similarly, if we had thinking of 1987, Ed had many memories come back, well, now we know that Ed is the person thinking of 1987. So if you have an introductory modifying phrase, you really need to make sure that there's something or someone that phrase can logically describe. Now, you can also have misplaced modifiers, so modifying phrases that are incorrectly positioned in the sentence. And what happens if you misplace that modifying phrase? Well, let's look at some more examples. So if we had the sample sentence of Walt saw a dog driving down the street. Well, if you think about this clinically and specifically, a natural question should come up. Who's driving? Is it Walt or the dog? And we can clarify that by making some changes. So if the sentence instead said, driving down the street, Walt saw a dog. Well, now driving down the street is clearly describing Walt. And while Walt was conducting the action of driving down the street, Walt saw a dog. Seems reasonable. But if instead we rearrange the sentence to read, Walt saw a dog that was driving down the street, well, now we've got real news. We've got a dog that is driving. And maybe that's possible. Maybe we've got some really intelligent Shelties out there. But that clarifies the ambiguity. And ultimately, what is often being tested when you're looking at errors of modifying phrases or modifiers in the GMAT is that they're wanting you to eliminate those sorts of ambiguities, like who is driving down the street. So let's take a look at one more situation that occurs, which is when you have a modifier that's literally in between two different possible subjects or objects that that modifier could be describing. So let's take a look at another example of workers at the office occasionally eat popcorn. Okay, so is it that the workers are at the office occasionally, or is it that they occasionally eat popcorn? We don't know, and this is another sometimes tested issue on the GMAT because you can't have that uncertainty of what the occasion is. So if we rewrote the sentence, however, as occasionally workers at the office eat popcorn, well, now we know that the occasionally activity is eating popcorn. Just all workers at the office, they occasionally will eat popcorn. Alternatively, we could rewrite the sentence as workers occasionally at the office. So now clearly distinguishing that it's the activity of being at the office that is now occasionally occurring. If you are an occasional worker at the office in this sentence, you eat popcorn. Maybe the full-time workers do not. So again, you don't want to dictate what the intended meaning necessarily is, but you have to have no ambiguity. And remember that you have to always default to the original sentence as written when it comes to issues of ambiguity. So let's take a look at a sample sentence correction involving potential absurd modifiers. So as always, we'll read the sentence at the outset. So sometimes called California's Galapagos, the Channel Islands are home to unique plants and animals in varieties nowhere else, as well as others that are closely related to mainland species. So you need to ensure that introductory modifying clause properly describes the nearest item. And in this case, the Channel Islands do logically make sense as the thing that are sometimes called California's Galapagos. So that's fine. And you need to focus on that intended meaning more than on abstract grammar rules to note that you can't call home to a variety of unique plants and animals the California Galapagos. You can't call unique plants and animals California's Galapagos. You can't call a unique variety or a variety of unique plants and animals California's Galapagos. So it has to be the Channel Islands that are called that specific thing. So we can eliminate choices C, D, and E pretty quickly just for having those logically absurd descriptions because they don't make sense as the thing that are sometimes called California's Galapagos. It's not going to be a home. Unique plants and animals can't be called this thing, and a variety can't be called this thing. So now we want to make sure that we match the intended meaning before and after the underlined portion. So we can see in the sentence as written in choice A that it's animals in varieties, nowhere else, as well as others, and that others has to match varieties. And a variety can't be closely related to mainland species. So that too is an absurd descriptor, even though it came after the underlined portion. And that can be one of the ways that the exam gets a little bit more difficult is they'll require you to consider both before the underline and after it. So then, of course, we always need to read our answer back into the original at the end. And in this case, we can see that unique plants and animals can be compared to other unique plants and animals that are closely related to mainland species. So if we read at the end, sometimes called California's Galapagos, the Channel Islands are home to unique plants and, or sorry, sometimes called California's Galapagos, the Channel Islands are home to a variety of unique plants and animals found nowhere else, as well as others that are closely related to mainland species. That, when we read it back into the sentence, confirms coherence and everything makes sense, and we select that answer choice. So now let's move on to talking about that more technical aspect about the differences between adjectives and adverbs and how that can be tested on some of the harder sentence correction questions. So adjectives can only describe nouns or pronouns. So that would be something like the quick cat. Quick being an adjective describes the cat, or the hungry bird. Hungry again being an adjective that describes a bird. You can use adjectives with linking verbs and create descriptors. So basically, the thing that the subject or object is. So the cat is quick, absolutely fine in English, and the verb or the bird is hungry is also equally acceptable. So both of those options work as well. And as far as adjectives go, you have to make sure that you consistently use what are known as comparatives or superlatives. And ultimately, this is the difference between like more and most, or ER in most cases, and EST. So the quicker cat means we are comparing two different cats. One is quicker than the other in direct comparison, hence the term comparative. The quickest cat is going to be the quickest cat compared to all other cats, so hence the term superlative. And you need to make sure that you don't allow an answer choice to subtly change from an original sentence that said quicker to quickest, because that is a definitive change in meaning that may not be supported by the information that is elsewhere in that sentence. So when it comes to adverbs, however, adverbs are ultimately, for our purposes, just going to be assumed to describe all of the parts of speech. Because we know that adjectives can only describe nouns or pronouns, we're just going to say that adverbs do everything else, although there are some really subtle distinctions. For the purposes of this exam, we want to go for like the 90 percentile categories. We're just going to say that if it's not a noun or pronoun, we're going to need to use an adverb to compare instead. So usually those adverbs are going to end with the suffix of ly. So a correct adverb usage would be the cat moves quickly, because we are describing the action that the cat performs of moves. So you say quickly because that is a descriptor for the action, and that action is a verb. So we use an adverb of quickly instead of simply saying the cat moves quick, because that would be an incorrect adjective usage. And we remember that the exam really likes to take advantage of conversational mistakes that you wouldn't catch unless you're really paying attention. If somebody says to you the cat moves quick in your real life, you'll go, yeah, I understand what's happening, but that is technically incorrect language. So let's take a look at one more sample sentence correction involving this kind of grammar. So as always, you'll read the sentence as it's written up front first. So most currently research, including chemical ecology research at Palmer Station and other sites along the western Antarctic Peninsula, is carried out in open water without solid overhead ice cover, and the equipment and techniques are very much like those used in colder temperate waters. So this is generally only an issue for harder sentence corrections, and you'll want to carefully track your descriptors and consider if each term requires an adjective or an adverb. So we start with most research. Well, most is an adjective and research is a noun, so that's absolutely fine. But if we bring in the currently we just established if you have an ly suffix is probably going to be an adverb, and in this case it is. And we know that an adverb cannot be used to describe a noun of research. So there goes both choices A and B based on that sole issue. You'll also note here that if you're confident in this error, you may not even have to read the rest of this relatively long sentence correction. And again, that's kind of the macro strategy of the exam, is that if you're savvy enough to catch this mistake early, you can really save time on this problem by not having to engage with everything in the non-underlined portion. Now, you do have to confirm that no choices confuse that originally intended meaning. So we're really just trying to categorize most research and most research that is happening now or currently. But if we go to choice C, most is current research, well, that introduces a subtle question of like, most of what is current research? So without that clarity, we've introduced confusion, and we know that the exam really doesn't like that as it pertains to any sort of modifier, so we can eliminate choice C. Then we have to beware of subtly changing the meaning from the comparative to the superlative. So we have more current versus most current. The original said most current, so we can't subtly change to a more current. And then, of course, we read our sentence back into the original to confirm that it captures the original intent. And most current research, including chemical ecology research at Palmer Station and other sites along the western Antarctic Peninsula, is carried out in open water without solid overhead ice cover, and the equipment and techniques are very much like those used in colder temperate waters. Everything's fine there. Again, if you're running out of time in the section, you may decide that just after like most current research, including chemical ecology research at Palmer Station, is enough to confirm that nothing after that part of the non-underlined portion is going to be affected. And again, expedite the process a little bit. So, how do we evaluate modifiers? Step one, carefully read the sentences written to ensure that all modifying phrases properly describe the nearest possible item in the sentence. Then you want to focus on intended meaning to eliminate any choices creating a logically absurd meaning. So, again, we saw that in some examples here during this lesson. If subtle changes in individual descriptive words in the choices, you need to confirm proper adjective or adverb usage. So that was that difference between current, currently, that sort of thing. So more, most, anything involving just descriptors that are changing so subtly, you really do have to confirm that you're using the right adjective or adverb or the right superlative or comparative. And you want to read your selection back into the sentence to ensure that it logically captures the intent of the original without any subtle changes in meaning. Again, possibly catching something like a superlative to comparative change or vice versa before making your selection and moving on to the next question. So let's move on over to the whiteboard and take a look at a couple more examples to see how we can execute on evaluating modifier issues on GMAT sentence corrections. We have a sample sentence correction, and let's set up the scratch pad as we do for every problem. We got A, B, C, D, E, and we put a little line over top for any error if we identify it. So, as always, read the sentence as it's presented first. Southern South America today has a highly diverse of environments, biomes, and biotas that are probable as the result of the complex interactions of plants and animals with several geological forces. Now, in this sentence, there are a couple of different issues that we can focus on, but let's just look at the conclusion. We've got are probable. Well, probable is an adjective, and that has to describe a noun. And there's no noun next to this probable. We've got are, which is a verb, and as, which is a conjunction. So there's not any noun that probable can actually be modifying. So we've found one of those more difficult to identify grammatical modifier errors. So we know that the probable here is incorrect. And we can see that we've got a probable that's wrong in A, we've got a probable that's wrong in B, and highly probable is still incorrect because highly can describe a noun or an adjective, or sorry, highly can describe an adjective as an adverb, but that probable still has no object that it can modify. So that's going to be incorrect as well. So we can eliminate A, B, and E all for this one issue. Now, then we want to look at the differences between C and D, and there are very few of them. And it can be really hard to identify that in D, we've got a highly diverse environment, biome, and biota, whereas in C, we've got diverse environments, biomes, and biotas. You have to remember that you're going to need to default to the original sentence when it comes to issues of meaning. And we can see in the original that there were environments, biomes, and biotas. So we can't subtly change to a single environment, biome and biota. Additionally, we know that a highly diverse environment, biome, and biota would be kind of difficult to accomplish because you'd be talking about diversity within one thing as opposed to a diverse multitude of things as we have in choice C. So as always, we'll read our answer back into the original to confirm that it captures the intended meaning. So Southern South America has highly diverse environments, biomes, and biotas, probably as the result of the complex interactions of plants and animals with several geological forces. And that captures the original intent without changing the meaning. And you'll note it is a little bit more succinct. We don't need a today here. That today is redundant. It can be really difficult to identify that in the original sentence until you compare it to the other answer choices, but recognize that shorter is generally better provided that we don't have any confusion introduced by any of the omissions, and we can confidently select C as the most concise and correct answer for this sentence correction. So let's move on down and take a look at one more little problem, and this is one of my favorites because when you catch an absurd modifier, it may actually kind of encourage you to let out a little stifled chuckle on the exam. So setting up the scratch work, we've got A through E here, and we read from the beginning. Before scuba diving, American lobsters proliferated in the Gulf of Maine. Wait a minute, what? We have scuba diving American lobsters? That's kind of crazy. And this would be a textbook absurd modifier. The exam doesn't want you to believe there are scuba diving American lobsters. That makes no earthly sense. We can't anthropomorphize non humans. There's not going to be a non human that's scuba diving in the Gulf of Maine and they proliferate on their own. That's really kind of disturbing if we've got mollusks that are proliferating on their own and using diving equipment. So we can eliminate choice A for that absurd modifier as soon as we find it without even reading the rest of the sentence as originally presented. And we then want to go find if there are any other scuba diving American lobsters in our other answer choices. And here we've got scuba diving American lobsters once again in choice B. In choices C, D, and E, we at least just have American lobsters in the Gulf of Maine that aren't necessarily scuba diving, and the scuba diving's been properly separated from those lobsters. So now we'll go look at the other answer choices. And again, consider the category of modifier to determine where an issue or error might be occurring. So we can see here in the other answer choices that the word before is subtly moving in the options. So in C, we've got American lobsters in the Gulf of Maine before scuba diving proliferated were assumed to have a relatively homogeneous population. And it's pretty much the same thing, although it varies a little bit before the proliferation as opposed to proliferated in choice D. But the original, it was before scuba diving, and there needed to be like a comma or some extra descriptors or conjunctions, transitions, some way to differentiate the scuba diving from the lobsters. But it's before scuba diving in the original that the American lobsters were assumed to have a relatively homogeneous population. And so if we move that before to after the lobsters are introduced, now it makes it seem like the uh, activity of scuba diving is uh, describing the lobsters still, although kind of strangely. So we're not trying to say that American lobsters before scuba diving were different than American lobsters after scuba diving. It's that the proliferation of scuba diving itself allowed for a change in the assumption. So both choices C and D still have absurd modifiers. They're just a little bit more subtle than the original one that had American lobsters that were participating in some interesting diving activities. So, as always, you want to read your choice back into the original, or in this case, when the entire sentence is underlined, the whole thing, to confirm that it doesn't have any other errors, especially around the categorical issue of modification that we identified. So, before the proliferation of scuba diving, American lobsters in the Gulf of Maine, so clearly describing the lobsters in that specific area, were assumed to have a relatively homogeneous population. So now we can see that it's because of the proliferation of scuba diving that we were to change the assumptions about the lobsters rather than that the lobsters themselves were affected by said scuba diving. And that is the intended meaning of the original and our correct answer. So go ahead and practice some of your own modification sentence corrections in our question bank to improve your performance with this particular meaning based issue that you'll encounter on the verbal section of the test.